Hi, we're looking at the challenge when we have several dates in our data model, and in this small example here in our project table we have two dates, start date and end date, and what we want to do is we want to join those both to a calendar table so we can group them both by year, quarter and month. In this video we're going to use a single calendar table to join to all the dates, but to compare and contrast with the last solution in the previous video, what we had there was a calendar table for each date. So joining to our start date we had a start calendar table, joining to our end date we had an end calendar table, and that allowed us to create the charts that we wanted to. The main disadvantage of that was that in our field list what we do is end up with lots of calendar tables. So there's a start calendar table for our start date, and there's an end calendar table for our end date, and when we have lots of dates in our project, in our Power BI data model, then we would have lots of calendars which could be confusing to the end user. So let's use our single calendar table here to connect to all the dates in our project table. As a reminder, before we do that, what we can do is a couple of charts, neither of these using the calendar table. We can show our number of projects by start date, that's the start date on the project table, and ditto our number of projects by end date. Now let's connect up our calendar table date to our end date first of all, and we see that we've got the relationship there. Let's go back to our chart, and what we can do here is our end date at the bottom, and we can replace the end date on our project with the date on our calendar. Let's just do that, and you can see that it's exactly the same. And now we can group our end date by the other calendar fields. For example, if I take year and quarter here, we can show it by year and quarter. Let's make that a bar chart, and let's get rid of date. The final thing we can do to tidy up is just hide our end date from the project field, because project table, simply because we don't need to see it. We'll always use the calendar date. We now need to join our start date to our calendar table, so let's do that. We'll go back to our model pane, and from the same calendar table we'll drag date to start date. And notice there's a relationship, and it's a dotted line relationship. That suggests it's an inactive relationship. There can only be one active relationship between two tables, because when we have a chart and we take a field from this table, say year month on our axis, and a field from this table, say number of projects, it needs to know unambiguously which relationship to use, so there can only be one. So to make use of this inactive relationship we have to build a measure. Let's do that now. We're back in our report pane, and I'll click on the new measure tab to start the process of creating a measure. The formula bar comes up. I'll just make it a bit bigger and the text a bit bigger, and we're going to call our measure number of projects by start date, and we're going to say we're going to use the calculate function, the DAX calculate function, which is able to take an expression which is our number of projects, and is going to tweak it in some way. And what we're going to say is that we're going to use another DAX function called USERELATIONSHIP, and USERELATIONSHIP takes two arguments. The first, and these are the columns, so one would be calendar date and the other column would be the project start date. A quick recap of what this measure is actually doing. It's going to take our base measure, the number of projects, but it's going to modify it in some way so that it uses relationship, the inactive relationship, and we define the inactive relationship by giving the two columns at either side of that relationship. Let's see how that works. So let's have a look at this chart, which is the number of projects by start date. What I'm going to do is, instead of start date on the project table, I'm going to replace that with date, and then by default it's by end date, and instead of number of projects I'm going to put the number of projects by the start date. And then we're back to the same chart. What I can do now, of course, is use my other calendar field, so I'll just use these from there and make that a bar chart. Go back to the part there. And so we have our number of projects by start date. Now let's just tidy up our model. This number of projects is using the default relationship, the active relationship is by end date. So maybe it's nicer to say number of projects by end date, rename that to number of projects by end date. And finally, we don't need the start date column in here because we'll always use the calendar date, so I will hide that. We would never put it on a visual. One advantage of this approach is now we've got a common date axis, so we can put our number of projects by start date and end date onto the same axis, onto the same chart. Let's create a clustered bar chart. Let's use our year and month from our calendar date table as our common axis and put our projects both on there. And what I'll do as well is just change the colors so we're consistent as usual, with our start dates being in green. And there we can see we've got both the start and the end date on the same chart. One possible disadvantage with this approach is that if we have lots of dates and we have lots of base measures such as number of project cost is another base measure, then we're going to create lots of these derived measures by start date, by end date measure. So that could be a bit of a chore, but we're going to look at later something called calculation groups that can help us with that in another video. I hope to see you then.